And welcome to No Law Firm Left Behind. I've got with me today my good, faithful friend, Dave Myers. Dave, how are you?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, and co-host. I want to make
Yes.
sure we point that out. Dave is our co-host. Dave, today's show is really your wheelhouse, right? It's all about the contracts and things like that, right? So why don't you tell everybody what we're going to talk about today?
Well, you know, the thing is, when people think about privacy and they think about security and they think about where the rules and the obligations and all that are coming from, a lot of times people will think, well, the state or the federal government or a particular industry is going to give me the set of rules that I have to follow. And if I don't follow them, bad things are going to happen. And people are right. But what we're going to talk about today is what I find to be that hidden risk, that blind spot for a lot of people. And it's that many businesses are signing contracts every single day that have language in them that's imposing certain security and privacy requirements on them. People are signing it, they're not looking at it, they're not paying attention to it, they're unaware of the fact that they're agreeing to these things. And in a lot of instances, they're missing opportunities to lower their risk through the process of actually reading some of this stuff. And so that's really what we're going to focus on today is how do we prevent missing, how do we deal with this blind spot?
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying, and look, this is your area of expertise. I'm the technology guy, right? I'm the security guy, the process guy. You're the legal guy here. And so what you're saying, in a sense, is that there's language in contracts and maybe regular everyday contracts people are signing every day that imposes the financial liability of a cybersecurity breach on these businesses. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. So here's what happens.
Mm,
Okay.
yeah.
You have governmental groups at the state level, at the federal level, at the international level, and they're passing rules. Okay. And they're saying, hey, any business that's above a certain size or meets some certain threshold has to comply by X, Y, with X, Y, and Z rules. And so a lot of businesses that are outside, the non-Amazons of the world are going, well, I don't come anywhere near these thresholds. So I don't have to worry about California privacy rules. I don't even do business in California. Why do I have to care about California rules? But what they don't realize is that a lot of the times they're wanting to get business from the Amazons of the world. And I just use Amazon, but I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it could be a business in any number. You could have banking clients, you could have healthcare clients, you could have clients in any of these different industries, or that are just large and therefore have to comply with the different state and international rules. Well, these businesses have entire internal legal departments. They have massive, international law firms that are representing them.
Hmm.
And you better bet that the minute these rules come out, they're saying, okay, how can we make sure that we're minimizing and controlling our risk?
Hmm.
And so what happens is that risk gets pushed downstream to their vendors. And it's not wrong that they do it. It's the fact that what happens is a lot of times the smaller businesses that are working with them will get a contract and like we're all guilty of it at some level in our personal lives, not reading every word of it,
Yeah, yeah.
and they'll sign it.
Just
Or
because they want the business, they're hungry for the
they want
business.
the business,
They
exactly,
feel
but
they
they
have
don't
no other way to,
understand
no other recourse.
exactly, but they could be taking on some pretty extensive
Hmm.
risk without realizing it. So, I want to set the framework here before we get into any detail. And just to be clear, this is a 101, level
Yeah,
discussion today. We're
yeah.
not going to get into the weeds. The goal of this show is not to be a legal discourse. It's to point out that these risks are there and to give people some eye opener that they need to be looking for it. But what you'll see in a lot of contracts is you'll see sort of a split between what are called your preventive language and your reactive language. So on the preventive side of things, you're going to see that a contract says you have to have this certain set of controls in place. You have to have a certain level of security, and you have to test it, and you have to let us know, and you have to give us some oversight that you're doing all the things to prevent a security breach.
Mm-hmm.
On the reactive side, the contract will include language that says, oh, and if something happens, here's the rules by which you need to notify us. Here's how the costs are going to be shared. Here's who's going to carry the burden of the cost of the response. And here's what the damage, what the liability caps are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And
and
so,
don't forget the requirements of insurance too.
yeah. And so, and that's a whole other discussion for a whole other day.
Yep.
But you will see insurance requirements that say you had to have a certain cyber liability insurance minimum and so on and so forth. And so what happens is people blow through these and they sign it. They don't realize what they're agreeing to. Now, today we're going to focus on the preventive side. We do a whole other show on the reactive side.
Yeah.
But today we're going to focus on sort of that preventive, because I think that there's a real nice discussion that you and I are going to be able to have that combine both the legal issues and the technology process issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you will typically see is a provision that says, hey, person about to sign this contract, you're agreeing and you're telling me that you have some level of security in place. Okay. And where things can get hairy quick is what that standard is. And what I see is kind of three different levels, if you will. First level, you'll see very commonly they'll use that lovely lawyerly phrase, reasonable levels of security, reasonable standards, reasonable controls, however that gets phrased. And it might just stop there. And it says, hey, you are saying you have a reasonable set of controls in place, a reasonable cybersecurity program. You might see a higher standard that says in accordance with industry best practices. Well, maybe it depends on what industry you're in, whether or not that's a now higher standard that you're agreeing to. You might also see language that says that at least meets the requirements of, and then you could see language referencing a certain accepted framework. So you might see the NIST cybersecurity framework. You might see the ISO 27000. You might see PCI. You might see HIPAA. You might see any of these individual frameworks. And if you see that named, now it's not just reasonable from a reasonable standard, but you're going to have certain minimum requirements by statute that are being imposed upon you.
Yeah.
Then you'll also see situations where, in addition to all that, language that says, oh, but in case there was any lack of clarity here, at a minimum, you have to have X, Y, and Z technologies in place. Okay?
It is. We've seen all of these together.
Yep. And so these things matter. All right? Because every time you add an additional threshold, an additional level to that security requirement, what you're saying you have in place goes up, which increases the chance that you're going to be in breach of that contract if you don't have it, or when something goes wrong, if you didn't have it, you're going to be in a much worse light. Okay?
Yeah.
Like I said, we're going 101 here today. So let's keep it at its base level, because one of the things that you have to understand if you're watching this today is that just because somebody puts that provision out there doesn't mean you had to accept it as is. So if you get a contract that says that you're going to have X, Y, and Z controls in place, maybe you don't, you have some options there. But before we even get to that, let's go back to the basics, which is if we just have your standard, what's a reasonable security? Um, if you get that contract and you sign it, what does it mean? And so I get this question a lot from my clients where they say, okay, can I sign this? Is this reasonable?
Hmm.
And we kind of have to turn that discussion on its head. We invert it. And that's really what I'd like to spend the bulk of the show talking about. And it's not so much what you need to have to be reasonable. It's that idea of if you don't have certain things, it's really hard to say it was reasonable. So it's really that what do we have to make sure that we have? And Jim, you and I see this all the time. And we know that there's certain key technologies that if you just don't have these things in place,
Yeah.
it's hard to argue that you had reasonable security. And so, one of the ones that just jump to mind is making sure that your machines are all up to date.
Yeah.
It's this concept of managing.
Very simple concept.
What are the other ones that you are typically
Well, one of the
employing for
things
people?
I want to say before we get into the weeds on this, I think people need to understand that this piece of paper is going to come across your desk, and you're going to panic if you don't have anything or don't know what you have, right, Dave?
Yeah, and
And I think it's important to talk about the fact that I think everyone understands that it's not an event, it's a process to get there. Yeah, it'd be great if it's already in place, but what do you do when it's not? And we can talk about the specific technologies, but
well, and we'll get
yeah,
to that.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah,
I want to circle back to that
yeah.
because I think that there's a baseline of things that if you don't have in progress,
Gosh,
if you don't have, you need to really pull back before you even have the discussion as to saying, I don't have X, Y, and Z. All right.
yeah.
So let's take an example, Jim. You
Okay.
go in somewhere and they're running, Windows, a combination of Windows 7 and Windows XP computers with bootleg licenses. And, they come to me, hey, can I sign this? I'm going
I've
to
seen
go
it.
out.
We've done that. We've been there. Let's talk about the reasonability of that for a second. They're not supported anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft has sunsetted these things. I still see them. We still see them.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's not even just that, okay? It's all the other applications that you might use in the line of security as well. If an application is sunsetted, it is not reasonable to, you're not reasonably protected,
Now,
right?
you might be able to go back and even address that with the other party and say, but we need it and we've got what we call compensating controls in place. But
Yeah.
if it's just that bare,
Hmm.
how can you be doing this? And that's the reaction you get from your IT group that comes in to look at it, your managed service or managed security provider. And they come in and go, oh my gosh, this is a dumpster fire. You have a really hard time signing a contract that says we have a reasonable program in
Yeah,
place.
but I'm Mr. Business Owner and I'm sitting here on $350,000 arbitrary number contract and I'm desperate for business,
Right.
man. Um, oh, we're okay. You know what I mean? I'm going to sign off on this.
And as long as nothing goes wrong,
Or you get audited.
you might be okay. Not
Yeah,
that I ever would recommend my
sure.
clients to sign something when they've got that. I just don't, I can't
Too
do
much of a
that.
risk. There, I've got a
Um,
really good example.
mhm,
Look, Dave. I think we both know most businesses aren't running older operating systems unless they have a very compelling reason. Most
right.
businesses updated to Windows 10. I think that's a reasonable assumption. It was free for a long time. It'd be crazy to see people not upgrade. But I'm going to tell you one that still to this day just surprises me. Okay, firewalls. Oh my
Yes.
gosh. I'm dealing with a company right now that once a new voice over IP system, new telephone system. Nobody buys phone systems to hang in their server closets anymore. It's all hosted, it seems like, and it's fine. But these things require firewalls, and every business just generally requires a firewall. And I do our investigation, and they're just running their cable modem, and they call it
Mhm.
their firewall. That is not reasonable,
Right.
you know.
And the thing is that failure to have these items in place because they're considered entry, it's table
Oh my
stakes
gosh, it
for
is.
security. And that's the thing. If you don't have these things in place, you know, you have a real hard time saying that you have a reasonable program in place. But what about the people that are up to date? What about the
Mm,
people that have the table stakes but might not have all of the latest and the greatest?
yeah.
This is where what you were saying, you don't need to panic. This is the situation where you have somebody who, I always like to say, it's not a dumpster fire by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we could do some things that would really shore up our situation. Okay. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of benefits to this. One, you do these things, it increases your security. Two, the more you increase your security, the less likely you are to have an incident that ever brings this stuff to pass, into question. And three, obviously, the more controls you have in place, the higher the chance that you're going to be meeting that reasonable standard, right?
Dave, I
But
want to add,
yeah,
we talked about this for a long time, you and I. I think it also improves your marketability.
it can absolutely be considered a competitive advantage.
Yeah,
Mhm.
you bet.
Yeah,
You
without
bet.
without question, because so many people, so many businesses are not on that constant improvement mindset, and that's what I want to focus on. Let's say you get a contract from a client, and that client says you need to have X, Y, and Z. You've passed the smell test because you're not running 20-year-old systems. You're
You've
not
got
running
antivirus, you've got
You've
firewalls,
got all that
you've
stuff.
got
You've got your
patching.
patching turned
Yeah,
on.
yeah,
Maybe it's
yeah.
not managed and reported on, but your systems are up to date. You
Mhm.
have somebody that's actually responsible for your technology instead of it being, just whoever the youngest person is in the office because, well, you're the youngest, you must be the most tech savvy.
Boy,
Okay.
it's so true. Do we see
Um,
it a lot still?
and I've seen it. I've
Or
seen
the
it.
or the brother-in-law. I always like the brother-in-law.
Exactly. Exactly. And so we're talking about that place that has core stuff in place. They're not by any stretch a dumpster fire. But at the same time, there's that concern because, well, they want me to have X, Y, and Z. I have X and Y.
Mhm.
I don't have Z.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is where, first of all, you have to read the stuff
Yeah.
because if you don't realize they're asking for X, Y, and Z, you're not going to identify the fact that you have X and Y, but you don't have Z. But what about when you do read it and you realize you don't have Z? This does not mean it's the end of the contract. It does not mean you're going to lose that client. I always caveat this. I mean, the client could say, well, if you don't have Z, we're firing you. Most of the time, that's not the case.
I've not seen that happen.
It's
Not that it
very
doesn't.
rare. It's
Not that it
very
doesn't.
rare. But what normally happens is you have to identify the fact that I don't have Z. And then you need to circle back around before you even go back and say, all right, what would it take to have Z? Do I have something that's as good as Z? Does Z not apply to me for some reason? Once you've determined that, no, I really do need Z, but I can't have Z overnight, you go back and you talk. This is where having an attorney who understands the reality of what it's going to take to get this new technology. I'm going to quit saying
Yeah.
Z because people are going to, just Z out. We have this control that's being requested, and you don't have it. Well, now you have to go back to the other party and say, I don't have this. I'll get it. But now it's important that you have legal and tech and your finance group, because most of the time this is going to cost some money.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to make sure that they're all on the same page so that we can put together a plan of saying, here's how we're going to get this new technology in place. Here's what we're planning on doing. Here's the timeline within which we're planning to do it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
If we have this plan and then we will circle back in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whatever the timeline is for that particular deployment, because some of these technologies can take 6 to 12 months to even deploy properly. And what I find is a lot of times that other party is going to be like, yeah, that's fine. We just need to know that you're working on it so we can show that we've done our due diligence. You have to show that you're doing that constant improvement. So it's not fatal that you don't have every last item that's in one of these contracts. What is going to be fatal is if you ignore it, miss it, or hide it.
The other thing I think, Dave, is okay, you look incredibly professional and ethical by just coming out and saying, we don't have that. There's so many points that are won with a potential customer just by saying that. And on top of that, take it to the next level and have your lawyer, you, review the documents and say, no, we're not here, to them or to their attorney. And you're talking next level reputation stuff here, right? It's not just that, okay, well, we're going to sign a contract and we've got this stuff. Yeah, we're good. No, we don't have this stuff. We admit we don't have this stuff, which is the ethical thing to do to begin with, right? And you don't want to lie. You don't want to lie because, man, that the bad stuff can come from that. But when I take it to my attorney,
causes problems. Yeah.
Yeah, what's that?
Hiding stuff can cause more problems than it's worth, for sure.
You don't want to hide it. You just don't. And there's so many ways that you could get caught in doing so down the road. But let's assume you don't know what to do. You turn to your attorney. You'd have your attorney negotiate that, right? Again, I think that speaks volumes about the type of business that you are, right? Not only are we saying we don't have it, but we're spending the money and the energy to tell you that we don't have it officially and then commit ourselves to meeting that expectation.
And that's the other that, I always tell people, when you pick up one end of the stick, you pick up the other. If you go and say in the process of a contract negotiation, hey, I don't have this, but I'm going to do it, you better darn well make sure that you're executing on that. Because where I have seen people get into trouble is when they go and tell somebody, I'll have that in place within 6 months. And then the client comes back 6 months later and goes, all right, show me the status. Yeah, I had other things come up. That's when it's going to look really bad. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's when you're not going to get as much flexibility going forward. And you might just end up fired. Okay.
Yeah.
Obviously, I can't go into any details on any particular clients, but the ones that have gone bad are when the client has said, yeah, I'm going to get something in place, and then they just didn't do it.
Yeah.
They
just kind of assumed you would just kind of ignore it. You signed a contract or not signed a contract, right?
Right.
And it just doesn't happen. Dave, I'm gonna sway this for a second, right? Because amazingly, this conversation has went so fast.
I know.
So, your regular old business attorney, should you turn to them? I mean, can they handle this? Dave, I know you have dedicated your career to this, and so yes, I'm kind of throwing a softball over to you, right?
I believe most business attorneys should educate themselves to be able to identify these issues.
Yeah.
Okay. Where I hesitate is for most business attorneys, unless they have experience in going through this process with people and seeing the realities of what it takes to add additional security controls, both from a cost, a timeline, work effort perspective. They could inadvertently promise something or say, oh, we'll have something within a certain time frame, and it's just patently unreasonable
They just
to
don't
make that
understand necessarily the
to make
timeline.
that, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
or to say, oh well, you know, you've got some free antivirus and something that said firewall on the box in it that you picked up from
Yeah.
a big box store,
Yeah.
so you have a firewall. It's really not good enough. And so if you don't, if you know, if a general business attorney doesn't have that technical understanding, I think they were more than capable of identifying those issues,
Mhm,
but it
mhm.
would behoove them to at least have a discussion with somebody who has experience with the technology itself
So
and
I'm a
been
business
through that
owner.
project.
So I'm a business owner. I have a business attorney that writes contracts up for me all the time,
Mhm.
right? Maybe they're technical, maybe they're not technical, but let's assume for this conversation they're kind of in between, right? Um, and I've got somebody that takes care, as a business owner, I got somebody that takes care of my technology. I
Mhm.
outsource. Okay. So reasonable for that attorney to bring in that technology consultant, or do you still think that maybe the two of them need to be involved, but you need someone with that knowledge and experience that you've worked so hard to get?
Yeah,
The
you
quarterback.
still want to have somebody involved,
Yeah. Yeah.
like myself. And the reason for that is because I I'm not going to take the place of the general business attorney. I don't want to negotiate the whole
Mhm.
contract. That's not what I do. But just like that general business attorney might pull in somebody who does tax work all day long
Yeah.
to rewrite or suggest the actual modifications to a tax provision, you would want to bring somebody like me in when we get to the point where you want to suggest some actual modifications.
Well,
It's all going to be informed by the IT source,
yeah.
whether internal or external. So that's another important thing that I want to make sure that any business attorney out there understands. You need to involve
Hmm. Hmm.
the IT group, whether it's internal, external, managed service provider, managed security provider. You have to include them. If you try to answer stuff without them informing you as to the status, you're going to have a giant mess on your hands.
Yeah. Yeah.
If
Dave.
you have if you have a set of things, do we have X, Y, and Z? And you can get the IT group to come back and say, yes, we have X, Y, and Z. In that case, you're relatively comfortable. But if you're in a situation where somebody's asking for something, especially if you don't have it and you got to go back to them, that's where you really need to make sure you involve somebody to properly phrase that and properly put those revisions in
And your
place.
IT staff are generally not going to write your security policies, the documentations that's
No,
necessary to go along with these things, like our
no,
administrative, technical, and so on controls.
correct. Yeah, I always recommend against that only because you wouldn't ask your lawyer to come in and configure your firewall.
Mm,
You know,
mm,
wouldn't ask your IT guy to write policy. A lot. That's just
yeah.
it can without understanding the uh, impact of what you're doing when adopting a policy. You don't understand the risks if you do it wrong,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
that's why
Same
I
thing.
always recommend that.
I think your tax attorney or a CPA, the analogy of the two was pretty good. So, well, listen, we're actually out of time.
Out of
You
time.
know, out of time. So, listen, Dave, great conversation. I think this was
Thanks.
invaluable. This will be on all the platforms for everyone to grab. Don't forget, we're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, so on and so forth. If you're not a member of our group on LinkedIn, go to LinkedIn and search No Law Firm Left Behind. Remember, not remember, but there are two No Law Firm Left Behinds. One is an organization, it's a company page, follow it, but join the No Law Firm Left Behind group on LinkedIn. And if you're looking for our past shows, please hop over to www.splice.net/no law firm left behind. That's where we keep all of our past shows. And you can also grab any one of the podcast episodes so you can see the videos or the podcast there. So, Dave, great show. I really appreciate the time. Looking forward to continuing this. And I think the response aspect of this is another conversation that we need to have.
Yes.
So, all right,
So too.
great show. Thanks a lot,
It's always a
everyone.
pleasure.
Take care.